with communities and the consultation process. We heard comments on environmental assessment or impact assessment, the actual undertaking of that work. And then we also received comments on participation in capacity funding, providing resources to communities so that they have the capacity to be able to review documents and conduct their own, for example, Indigenous knowledge studies. There were other comments on ownership and maintenance or operations of the road. There were comments on socioeconomic impacts of the project. There were a number of comments on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as water or water quality, and wildlife and plants had many comments as well. So there were comments from a lot of communities, a lot of First Nation organizations, and about many different subjects. Let's move now to talk a bit about the study plans. There are many studies involved in an environmental assessment. The technical team had to prepare detailed plans explaining to the federal government how these studies will be done. So these are very detailed sort of recipes as to how the work will be undertaken at a very technical level, and these were reviewed by the federal government, by experts in the federal government. So there were a number of different technical study plans prepared, and the subjects include geology, terrain and soils, surface and groundwater, air quality and climate change, noise and acoustic, vegetation, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, species at risk, socioeconomics, human health, visual environment, and cumulative effects. Our team also prepared fact sheets to summarize. Now we will talk about how an environmental assessment is done. There are many steps involved in an environmental assessment. One of the steps is to identify what we call valued components. Valued components are the environmental, health, social, economic, or additional elements or conditions of the natural and human environment that may be affected by the project and are important to community members, are of concern or value to the public, Indigenous peoples, federal, provincial authorities, and interested party. They are what people are concerned about. Then we have indicators. Indicators represent the resource, feature, or issue related to a valued component, so what's important to community members. And if these indicators are changed, they may demonstrate an effect on the environment. A better way probably to describe them is a way of measuring potential effects. And it's used in the assessment and evaluation of alternative routes and the overall effects of the project. Now let's talk a bit about assessment boundaries. For each thing that community members think is important to study in an environmental assessment, a valued component, a study area needs to be defined. These are different depending on the valued component, and that's a very important thing to remember. So there are three general study areas. What we call the project area or project footprint. Then we have 1 kilometer on either side of the road center, which is called the local study area, and the regional study area, which is 5 kilometers on each side of the center line of the road. Those are the general study areas. And this next map shows the three basic types of study areas relative to the two alternatives, the community-based alternative and the technically preferred alternative, which looks at the community-based alternative and makes minor changes to the route based on better terrain and soils and other factors. Let's now talk about the study areas for valued components more specifically. The study areas for valued components, or things that are important to community members, are determined by many different things, including what community members are saying, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous land and resource use, and Aboriginal and treaty rights. Now we're going to move to talk a little bit about baseline studies. Think of baseline studies as a way of finding out the way things are now, so what we call existing conditions. And if we know that, we have something to compare to when looking at possible impacts of the project. So it's a snapshot, a picture of the way things are before the project. There are many studies that are done as part of an environmental assessment. These studies look at three general areas: the natural, or what we call biophysical, socioeconomic, and cultural. They're all under these categories. For example, let's look at natural or biophysical. Within that, we would have studies on vegetation, such as the peatlands or wetlands and forests, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, species at risk, air quality and climate change, noise and vibration, visual environment, surface water, groundwater, and geology, terrain, and soils. So there are many studies on the natural or biophysical in the natural or biophysical category. Now, if we look at the socioeconomic infrastructure and social services, then we might look at human health. We might look at land and resource use, or Indigenous knowledge and land and resource use. Then we look at another major category of studies, which is archaeological resources or built heritage or cultural heritage landscapes. So there are many groups of studies, and even within the studies that I mentioned, there are more studies that are done, more specific studies. For example, if we were to look at caribou, there are a number of different types of caribou studies that are done as part of an environmental assessment or an impact assessment. Let's now look at select valued components as examples. And this will hopefully help everyone sort of better understand what I've just been talking about. So let's look at study areas for wildlife. The general or local study area would be a 1 kilometer buffer, as I mentioned before, from the center line of the alternatives, 500 kilometers from what we call supportive infrastructure. So these are things other than the road that are required as part of the construction or operation of the project. These might be camps or aggregate or rock source areas or access roads. And then the regional study area, general regional study area, extends 5 kilometers on either side of the local study area boundaries. If we look at moose, for example, that has a different local study area. In that case, it's 10 kilometers from the center line of the alternatives, 500 meters from supportive infrastructure, but the regional study area extends 50 kilometers from either side of the local study area boundaries. Then we look at caribou. Caribou have an 11 kilometer buffer from the center line of the two alternatives, and from the same distance from supportive infrastructure camps. So it has a bigger distance around it to define the local study area. And then the regional study area for caribou includes entire ranges of caribou, which is these are very, very large areas. Next, and finally for wildlife, let's look at Wolverine. Wolverine has an 11-kilometer buffer from the center line of the alternatives and from the supportive infrastructure, and it extends 50 kilometers from either side of the local study area boundaries. Let's have a look now what that means in terms of maps. So these next few maps will illustrate the different types of study areas I just discussed. So this first one is the general study areas that I was talking about. The next slide shows the different local and regional study areas for moose. And then after that, we have the wildlife study areas for wolverine. So as you can tell, you can see the 50-kilometer buffer around there, much larger area. And then finally, the largest study area you can see here, you can see the local study area on the actual map, and then the regional study area, which includes 2 ranges for caribou, and that is in the upper right corner. So it's a much larger area. So let's talk a little bit about wildlife again, and some of the criteria or valued components associated with wildlife, just to give you an idea of and a better understanding through examples. So for wildlife, you might have forest birds, you might have raptors, you might have shorebirds or waterfowl, or bog and fen birds like muskeg birds and other wetland birds. You might have bats or fur-bearing animals like lynx or rabbits, ungulates, which are moose, for example, amphibians and reptiles, and then pollinating insects as well. So the indicators or the ways of measuring those could be, for example, changes to habitat availability, the quantity of habitat available. Is that impacted by the road? Could be changes to abundance, meaning actual numbers, or the distribution, the spatial distribution, where these animals are over the land or water. Could be changes in the species richness. When we talk about that, we mean the diversity of species, the number of different species. Could be changes to survival and reproduction. Could be changes to predator access, habitat use, and population. Or it could be changes in wildlife mortality or due to stress from. So let's talk a little bit about the baseline studies for birds. Spring and fall aerial water bird surveys were conducted in 2019 and 2020. And some of the things that we found were that the large lakes, and this isn't that surprising, were staging areas for waterfowl. Smaller lakes and rivers aren't really used that much by migrating waterfowl. We also conducted breeding bird surveys in 2020 and 2021. And we did listening counts at 263 stations. And we also used things called acoustic recording units at many different locations, actually 89 different locations, to listen to the sounds in these areas. The next slide shows some pictures that were taken from our breeding bird survey fieldwork. We also conducted baseline studies on bats to look basically for how many species are present. So we looked at, as I mentioned, bat diversity or number of species, and we used listening devices, what we call ultrasonic recorders. And we did surveys at 10 different locations. We found 5 species of bat, including the little brown bat, which is endangered in Ontario. We conducted a number of baseline studies on caribou as well. Caribou aerial surveys were conducted in 2018, 2019, and 2021. These are aerial surveys where we have biologists looking down and counting the number of caribou and identifying male, female, and making other observations about other large mammals. We also conducted in 2020 a caribou calving study, both by foot and by helicopter. We conducted a caribou collaring study in 2021, and that helped us identify calving areas where community members where caribou would have their young, winter areas, and identify travel corridors by being able to track the individual caribou across the landscape. And so far, the data has shown that most collared caribou are of the what we call the eastern migratory population that winters in wooded areas, but actually has their young along the Hudson Bay shoreline. Next are a few pictures of some of our from some of our caribou aerial surveys. And then the slide after that shows photos from our collaring study as well. So let's talk a little bit next about baseline studies for wolverine and amphibians. We conducted, starting in 2021, a wolverine occupancy study. And so we set up sampling stations called run poles that at 25 different sites within 10 kilometers of the planned road center line. And then these stations were set up to include what we call snag posts to collect hair from the animals that would visit. And then there were wildlife cameras set up. From this work, not only did we get a boundary of wolverine in Ontario, and we've gotten some really interesting results from that. We also did some amphibian studies where we sampled for calling frogs by using these acoustic recording units that we had set up for breeding bird studies. And this allowed for evening surveys to be done in these remote muskeg or wetland areas that we wouldn't be able to get access to otherwise. So next, let's move on to talk a little bit about Indigenous knowledge. A big part of an environmental assessment is Indigenous knowledge. We have, with the Webequie Supply Road project, an Indigenous knowledge program. We need communities to share their Indigenous knowledge with the technical team to help us identify potential project effects. This helps us avoid or reduce potential effects on Indigenous rights and interests. As part of doing this work, we take the Indigenous knowledge that we are able to collect. We make sure that it is kept confidential to whatever degree the community would like us to. And then we combine this information with the Western science information to very comprehensively identify impacts of the project. We want to work together with your community to collect important Indigenous knowledge. As I mentioned, we will respect the need for confidentiality. We have communicated with communities about the need to collect Indigenous knowledge for the project, and we've also invited communities to participate in our Indigenous knowledge program. So again, this is a very, very important part of this environmental and impact assessment, collecting Indigenous knowledge. And we really would like to encourage communities to provide that input to us so we can make sure that we've assessed impacts of the project very, very thoroughly. Let's move now to talk a bit about consideration and evaluation of alternatives. We have different route alternatives that have been developed by working with community members. Of the two alternatives, one is what we call the community preferred route, and the other is based on where the best land for road building is. So it's sort of the technically preferred route. We're also looking at different locations for sources of road building material, such as gravel and rock. This next map shows the two alternatives. In yellow is the community preferred route, which was derived by Webequie First Nation members meeting over a fairly long period of time to discuss the best possible route for the road. And then the green line represents technically preferred version of that route, looking at the best areas to travel through in terms of best terrain to build in generally, and other factors as well. Each alternative does get evaluated in detail, and there are many factors involved in that evaluation, such as natural environment, Indigenous knowledge, land and resource use and interest, socioeconomic and cultural heritage, and of course the technical side, cost, constructability, and safety. And the purpose of the evaluation of these routes and aggregate or rock sources is to identify a preferred route and preferred locations for sources for aggregate and rock that has the least potential for bad effects, for negative effects, and the greatest opportunity for controlling those negative or bad effects, and offers the community the greatest benefit as well. The evaluation of alternatives also considers other facilities that are part of building the road, such as temporary access roads to get to those gravel pits and quarries, for example, to get to the laydown and storage yards, construction camps, as well as bridges. Let's talk a little bit about consultation approach and next steps. We will be talking to communities in the next few months. We have 3 rounds of consultation planned as part of the environmental assessment phase of the project. This presentation is for round 1. But as you can see in this slide, we have the 2 other rounds, round 2 coming up hopefully in fall of 2022, and in winter or spring of 2023, the final round, round 3. This round talks about the overall IA process. It talks about the IK program. It talks about criteria and indicators, the evaluation of alternatives. The next round, round 2, will summarize the input that we got, identify alternatives, identify preferred routes for the road and aggregate or rock source areas, and provide some preliminary engineering design elements. And then finally, round 3 will be a summary of round 2, what we found in round 2, and a summary of preliminary effects, early effects based on our analysis of the project, and proposed ways of managing project impacts or mitigating impacts, limiting or controlling impacts, and then talking about follow-up monitoring, either during construction or post-construction. We will be collecting your feedback on the project in many ways, including community meetings, interviews, open houses, live streaming sessions, the project website, and social media. There are many different ways available to collect feedback from your community, and we welcome input from you in terms of how you would like to communicate with us. In terms of next steps, let me just talk about where we are here now. We are looking for input to finalize the criteria and indicators, as well as identify study areas for the valued components. We're looking to continue with our baseline studies and collect Indigenous knowledge. Now, in fall of 2022, we're looking for input to evaluation of alternatives and selection of the preferred route and locations for the construction material sources, aggregate and rock. And we'll be doing the preliminary engineering design of the road. Then, in winter of 2023, we'll be getting input to preliminary effects, assessment of the project, and input to proposed impact management, mitigation, and follow-up monitoring. And then finally, in the summer and fall of 2023, there would be a review of the draft and final environmental assessment report or impact statement, the document that goes to both the provincial and federal governments. We want to hear from you. Please provide us with your comments through the project website, which is supplyroad.ca. Speak with the project team after the presentation. Fill out a feedback form. We have contact information on the screen for you. We welcome your input, we will respond to you, and it will make the environmental assessment and impact assessment better with your input. Thank you for joining us today. Miigwech, and we will see you soon. Welcome back, everyone. I hope the presentation has given community members lots of ideas for questions to ask us about the project, because we're almost at the point where we're looking for questions that our team can respond to and hopefully give you answers. But before we do that, Michael and I are going to briefly go through what community members have said to date about the project. Because there's been a few things that have been mentioned sort of regularly over time, I think, Michael. And so maybe I'll start with the first one, and feel free to jump in and add to it as we go. So one of the comments we've received to date, and it's not unlike, I think, other projects conducted, is concerns about impacts on water quality and fish communities or fish habitat, Mike.
Yes, especially that area. You know, it's a lot of the watersheds, the waterways are extremely important. It's a mode of travel and a source of drinking water, and not just for us humans, but the four-leggeds and you know, it's a the indigenous communities that they recognize, you know, all the, I guess you say, you know, everything's connected. You know, if the water's polluted in some way or affected in some way, and then affects the fish, and you know, they're netting fish or you know, ice fishing, whatever. Like so, there's what, you know, what we as technicians call pathway effects, right?
Yes.
You know, where the different value components are interconnected, and I think communities have more of an intuitive understanding of that. You know, just the sort of the relational way of thinking than the sort of compartmentalized way of thinking when it comes to Western science.
And I think Michael, another observation that I have made too is that going into this process, I think a lot of community members didn't realize how comprehensive, how thorough an environmental assessment is, and how many different types of studies are being done. Because, for example, with water, we're doing many different types of studies, whether it's groundwater or surface water, right?
That's right. Yeah, and I think the other thing too is that all comments, right, during the draft tour period, the proposed tour period, you know, the public review periods where it's not just Indigenous communities getting to review this, you know, the work plan around the tour or the TISG guidelines, tailored
Impact statement guidelines. Yeah.
Yes.
TISG.
TISG for short, where it's all for public comment, Indigenous comments, but even the subject matter experts. The federal governments have their own experts, where they have a say in the scope and the study, the methodologies, the different study areas that you showed, as well as the province. So part of the body of experts is what we call internally a government review team. And the government review team is subject matter experts in their respective fields that provide comments, expert comments into the draft tour. So, you know, like it's not like it's this ongoing conversation, you know, about the studies, and then once, or at least the parameters of the studies, but also at the end, you know, when we have a draft report, we'll go through that again, you know, and on the public review period, and taking people's comments and into considerations.
No, it's so true, Mike. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of overview, peer review, I guess is the best way to describe it, of the technical work that's being done. We've gone to communities, we've gone to Webequie in particular, and gone through components of all of the study plans. We did that late last year. with community members to try to make sure that they could see exactly what we're planning on doing as part of the work and why we're doing that. And they see helicopters flying around and people installing things here and there. They want to know what it's all about and where does it all fit into the big picture. And I think that's been helpful. But definitely, there's a lot of oversight. There's a lot of expertise from the technical Western science perspective, and then from the Indigenous side as well too, and hopefully more if we're able to
Mhm.
get the Indigenous knowledge that we're looking for as part of this work. Another comment, Mike, that we've received is, and we've heard this a number of times, is the need for, and it's not necessarily a question that can be answered by this project or the staff on this project, but it's still an important comment, and that's the need for additional infrastructure for Webequie beyond the all-season road, so that they can develop themselves economically. So that might be improved health facilities, whether it's physical health or mental health, maybe some healing facilities, things of that nature to help the community heal and be ready to tackle some of the opportunities that they're going to have in front of them shortly.
Yeah, and it's part of the socioeconomic conditions that our good friend Marion is helping with, and that's a complicated questions. The complicated phenomena, social phenomena, because there's pre-existing conditions, and there are different reasons why the pre-existing conditions, and then at the same time you have sort of the community's aspirations. What this Webequie Supply Road means for them. The primary purpose of the Webequie Supply Road is an economic development road that's going to facilitate the movement of supplies and materials and people to potential job sites in the Ring of Fire. Either that's mineral exploration or the proposed mine site developments. So yeah, it means different things to different people. It could also mean better access to traditional areas, other or I should say faster access maybe. They do go in the area, but it's limited by the trails and waterways and seasonality in many cases. But you were there, Don, when we were looking at what people don't know is that the routing that we have now for the Webequie Supply Road was largely shaped by Indigenous knowledge. The most fastest and technical best way was a different route altogether that we considered when we first engaged with Webequie. And we were instructed not to go in certain ways in certain areas for the reasons that they shared, and that's why it's kind of a wavy road, curvy road for the Webequie Supply Road. It was largely shaped by Indigenous knowledge and the land utilization patterns of the Webequie members.
And Mike, the technical team basically took that route and asked its specialists to just make minor refinements to that route to come up with, given that's the shape of the road, how it's going to go from the beginning to the end, how can we adjust it slightly to take advantage of better land, better terrain, right? So it's sort of a modified version of that preferred route, essentially, right?
Yeah. But I get the point where Webequie's part of the comments was, you hear, you can provide all the jobs you want, but if you don't have a healthy workforce,
yes,
then it's going to be problematic, trying to realize the benefits through the employment opportunities. So a healthy workforce, both mental health and the physical health and the well-being. I think the principle, as part of the three-tier model is really is about improving the quality of life of the communities. And I see this there's different pathways for many communities to reach that quality of life, but this is Webakwe's pathway to realize something that's in their area.
Well, that's right, Mike. And that three-tier model with the community at the core, and then the cultural aspect of it, the next tier out, and then beyond that, the economic development tier. So you really have to take care of that core first in order to be able to have the benefits, the economic development benefits that come down the road. One other comment that we got, Michael, was or a question we got was, are we considering impacts on land users and animals? And that's just a huge part of our work, is trying to gather that information, isn't it, about where are the animals, where are the areas that they use, and where do the land users go, and when do they go, right? So that we can help make sure that the road isn't interfering with those traditional activities.
Yeah, it's it was a learning curve for me, learning how the method. I know they, in technical talk, I guess, they do trying to figure out the abundance of certain species, like how many caribou or the abundance of their caribou. And then they talk about the distribution, the density of that population or species. And again, that's just technical talk, but it's really just how many and where are they kind of thing. And that's for a variety of the species of mammals and fish, birds, etc. That we've looked at, and they're all connected. So it's not just fish, but it's like fish habitats, right? Not just wildlife, but wildlife habitats, and so it is quite comprehensive. It's the most comprehensive EA in Ontario that they voluntarily entered into, that Webakwe did. And then we have I'm assuming, a more robust federal process with the new Impact Assessment Act of Canada. So we are under both regimes right now, and the guiding or North Star that we're following is harmonizing the three-tier model with those regulatory processes.
And Mike, that baseline field data collection, it's it's very, very thorough. I mean, I can give you an example. We have collared 29 caribou, I believe. So we're actually monitoring the movement of those caribou to understand the areas that they use, and then that information all feeds into the road, right? And trying to control or limit impacts, conflicts between where the road's going and where the caribou are, for example. And then we have these devices that I mentioned during the presentation. I like to call them listening devices, like they're wildlife spying devices, acoustic recording units, and they record sounds in the wild over long periods of time. And we had, I believe, almost 100 of these deployed across the study area. So that information all gets processed, and we get an idea of what is where, right? We get a really good idea of what is where. So we're getting a pretty good picture of what's going on in this study area. So that wraps up. Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
No, I was going to mention, I think this is very, very important. And, there's probably in every community, whether that's a town or a city, a village or a rural, remote, urban, same with Indigenous. Sometimes it's just a handful of people interested in certain things. They go to the town hall meetings, or they go to the open houses, the information sessions. They're just, they're active, they're aware, they want to participate, they want to have their say. So this Don, like we've been doing this for a long time now. But what's really new with the federal process is the gender-based analysis
Yes.
plus, and what that means is that they're not looking for the typical voices, which can be just largely male voices or the leadership voices. They're actually looking to go a bit deeper in trying to obtain a sort of the diversity of voices out there, the women and the men, the elders, the youth, the two-spirited, etc. So it's a diverse range of views that we're trying to acquire and document for this project. So we'll be doing focus groups. We'll be doing surveys. What do you call those subject or I forget, the one-on-one interviews, one-on-one interviews
Key informant interviews.
Yes, thank you.
Yep.
Key informant interviews. To trying to get those range of voices so that all the concerns and all the issues and all the hopes and aspirations are captured and documented and then reflected back to the community. So I always try to get people to get involved. There's no harm. Information is just information. It's nothing scary about getting information, and there's a lot of people around us that can help you understand that information.
That's right, and there's many ways they can get in contact with us, we are going to be and have been very visible during this project because we want that information. We want to hear your input from as wide a range of people as possible. We want to make this environmental assessment as comprehensive as it possibly can be. And I will have to see now if we have any questions, see if anyone has submitted any questions to us. Doesn't appear we have any questions, Mike, today. So with that, I would just like to thank everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you actually in the community. We like talking to you virtually, but we like talking to you in person better. So hopefully we'll be doing that very soon. And don't forget to join us actually on Wednesday, April 6th, for our radio show between 2:30 and 3:30 Eastern Time. And then our live streaming session, 4:30 to 5 p.m., where we will be talking about the socioeconomic studies associated with the Webequie Supply Road project. And then 2 weeks from then, on April 20th, we will talk about the human health work that's being done as part of this work. So that hopefully that'll be of interest to community members. So without further ado, we will talk to you again soon, and thank you for joining us. Miigwech.
Miigwech.